Good evening, friends. My name is Eli Sachs. I'm the director of the program in Jewish Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first program in our two-part Israel/Palestine Studies webinar series, Plague and Quarantine, Past and Present. We're very proud here at CU Boulder to be the home of the first endowed chair in Israel/Palestine Studies in North America. We're sort of excited that there's now a second also, and that this has been a trend that we've been able to help launch. And we're really thrilled about the types of conversations and learning and exploration that this type of position makes possible. And I just want to begin by thanking the Department of History for partnering with us on this initiative and on tonight's program. We're very grateful. So tonight, in the first part of our series, we're going to have the opportunity for a conversation with Professor Rhona Seidelman of the University of Oklahoma, and our topic will be Under Quarantine, Immigrants and Disease at Israel's Gates. And momentarily, I'm going to turn things over to my friend and colleague, Professor Hilary Kalsman, who's our endowed Israel/Palestine Studies chair, and she'll introduce Professor Seidelman. First, though, I want to offer a word about the kind of learning community that we're going to be creating tonight. We see this webinar as a space for conversation, and we really hope that it will be that, and that's going to take place in three ways. So first, after Professor Seidelman presents for about 25 or 30 minutes, she and Professor Kalsman will be in conversation with one another. Second, after that, we want to open things up, not just for a genuine discussion between Professor Kalsman and Professor Seidelman, but also for a genuine discussion between all of you and Professor Seidelman. And the way that you can participate in that discussion is by using the Q&A function on your screen. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see something that says Q&A, and you can type in any question there, and we'll share that with Professor Seidelman, and she will respond to the group. And you don't need to wait to the end of the presentation to start putting those questions in there. You can kind of add those questions as they occur to you throughout the program, and we'll try to kind of gather them together at the end. And then finally, we want this to be an opportunity, not just for a conversation between Professor Kalsman and Professor Seidelman, and not even just for a conversation between all of you and Professor Seidelman. We really want this to be an opportunity for a conversation between all of you and one another. And the way you can do that is with the chat function at the bottom of your screen. If you click on chat, I see some of you are doing this already, and set it to message all panelists and attendees, you can post something with the group. And as we're introducing the program, I really want to invite you to introduce yourself, say who you are, where you're joining us from, and why you decided to join this event tonight. We are a community of learning, and community is formed through these kinds of connections. Okay, so none of you are here tonight for me, so I now want to turn things over to my friend and colleague, Professor Hilary Kalsman.
Hi, thank you, Eli. And I want to thank everyone for being here. So I'm really excited to introduce Professor Seidelman. She's the Schusterman Chair of Israel Studies and an assistant professor of history at the University of Oklahoma. Her research looks at the history of medicine, public health, of immigration, and the history of Israel. She's originally from Canada, but now she's in Oklahoma. She has a BA and an MA from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and her PhD is from Ben Gurion University of the Negev. She's also taught at Ben Gurion University and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her book, which we're going to hear about tonight, is called Under Quarantine, Immigrants and Disease at Israel's Gate. And I'm not going to give away the book because we're going to hear more about it. But I also wanted to let you know she has two new really exciting projects. So one of which is about the children of Egypt's Jewish diaspora, currently titled Claiming My Egypt. And the second one is Zionism, Tuberculosis in the Making of the 20th Century, which is about patients' experiences with tuberculosis in Palestine and Israel today. Professor Seidelman has published a lot of really wonderful articles. She has one forthcoming. And again, I just wanted to say how happy we are to have you here virtually, and we're really looking forward to the talk.
Thank you so much, Hilary. This will just take me a moment to get my screen set up, so please bear with me. Okay. One more moment. Okay, I think this should be good. So thank you so much to Professor Kalisman and Professor Sachs for inviting me to give this talk. And thank you to Sean Wall for helping to take care of all of the very daunting technical aspects of today. And thanks to all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here this evening. I would like to mention that this talk was scheduled far before the presidential debate was announced as being tonight. But I do expect to be done in time for everyone to catch the end of the debate if that's something you'd like to do. I'm delighted to be speaking as part of this important series on plague and quarantine in Israel and Palestine. However, I must say that I'm quite disappointed that this is the way that I'm experiencing Colorado. And I do hope that once this terrible time is over, I'll have the opportunity to come to Boulder in person. On the other hand, I am delighted that my colleagues, friends, and family from across the globe can be at this talk tonight. In particular, I do want to mention my parents, Bill and Rhona Seidelman, who I believe may be up in the middle of the night in Jerusalem to be at this talk, and that's particularly special for me. So the last time I gave a talk on my book was on March 4th, 2020, and that was here at the University of Oklahoma in Norman. This was something of a book launch since my book had just come out a few months prior. So that talk on March the 4th was to a crowded audience. I shook hands with people there. I hugged people. And at that time, the idea of quarantine was something that was very theoretical to pretty much everyone in the audience. Although I have been studying the history of quarantine for longer than I care to remember, certainly these past 7 months have put my work in a new light. Today, I'll be presenting the main findings of my book on Shaar Ha'aliya and quarantine, and then I'll take some time to reflect on the ways that the coronavirus pandemic has shaped how I think about my research. So I want to begin today by getting us briefly acquainted with Shaar Ha'aliya. The easiest way to understand Shaar Ha'aliya is as Israel's Ellis Island. It was located near the city of Haifa, and it was the major immigration processing camp in Israel during the period of the mass immigration that followed the establishment of the state in 1948.
Professor Seidelman,
Oh yeah.
I'm so sorry to
No,
interrupt you.
no.
You asked me to let you know if there were any visual issues. I think the
Yes.
very bottom of your screen with the caption of the images
Is
might
not
be cut
showing.
off a little. I'm so sorry.
No,
for
I'm really glad that you've done this. Thank you. And I was the one who told you. I know that you wanted to.
Look,
Is that good?
That looks perfect, and I will now magically disappear.
And please reappear if there are any other problems. Thank you. Okay. So just to go back to that, it was the major immigration processing camp in Israel during the period of the mass immigration that followed the establishment of the state in 1948. In English, its name means Gate of Immigration. This here is a photograph from the camp's opening in March 1949. The people we see here are Yuda and Leah Weisberger. Leah was a nurse at the camp, and Yuda was the camp's director from 1949 until 1957. And these were during Shaar Ha'aliya's busiest and most significant years. Yuda had immigrated alone 13 years earlier, and he was 19 years old at the time that he immigrated, and he was escaping virulent anti-Semitism in his native Poland. This move to what was then Palestine at the time, this move to Palestine likely saved his life, since indeed his father and his sisters were murdered in the Holocaust. In this period of the mass immigration, the country was facing an extraordinary influx of migrants. Between May 1948 and January 1952, nearly 700,000 people moved to Israel. This is nearly doubling the country's entire population in only a few short years. So just to give you a sense of what this meant, under British rule, the Jewish community in Palestine brought in around 1,500 immigrants a month, while in contrast, during this period of the mass immigration, they now had an average of 10,000 immigrants arriving every month. These immigrants were from over 30 vastly different countries. The largest communities to go through Shaar Ha'aliya were from Iraq, Romania, Poland, Turkey, and Iran. For some, this move to Israel was an act of nationalism. They were excited about being a part of the new Jewish state. For others, it was a last resort and a refuge. For many others, Israel was a country that was open to Jews, which was unlike most other countries at the time. So when I look at this photograph, I often think about how different Shaar Ha'aliya was in this moment from what it became. The plan at this point was that the camp would hold 5,000 new immigrants. They would stay there for around 4 to 5 days. At the camp, they underwent a medical exam and they were assigned permanent places of residence in Israel. And then from Shaar Ha'aliya, the immigrants were bused to their new homes in Israel. So that was the plan. But what actually happened was that it became impossible to evacuate the immigrants who were already residing there before the new ships arrived. And although some people did manage to complete their processing and leave the camp in a number of days, many others ended up staying in Shaar Ha'aliya for weeks or months. Excuse me while I adjust something here. The camp became filled beyond capacity with thousands more people than it was intended to hold, and tents were put up to provide additional housing, and often these were insufficient as well. Depending on when a person arrived, the possibilities for where they would stay were either the cabins, the tents, or any other haphazard arrangements when there was nothing else available. One family was housed in the police cabin when nothing else could be found. Another woman spent her first night in Shaar Ha'aliya outside, sleeping on her luggage. With such crowding, it's not surprising that the camp area became filthy and life in Shaar Ha'aliya became very tense for both immigrants arriving there as well as the people who were working there. Shaar Ha'aliya was officially closed only in 1962, but this is after slowly petering out. In its 13 years of operation, nearly 400,000 immigrants passed through its gates, with the overwhelming majority concentrated in 1949 until 1952. Although in various stages of the mass immigration, there were other areas of controlled immigration, sort of centers, Shaar Ha'aliya was the only central processing camp. It has no parallel in Israeli history. And indeed, I argue that we cannot fully understand Israel until we understand Shaar Ha'aliya. Here was the country's crucible, a gateway for nearly 500,000 immigrants. This is where they began to be changed into the Israeli people, and where the Israeli people began to be profoundly changed by them. Soon after the establishment of Shaar Ha'aliya, people in and outside of Israel were immersed in a discussion of its function and its perception as a quarantine. The idea that this central port of arrival for Jewish immigrants to the Jewish state could be a quarantine raised passions and resulted in contentious, turbulent debate. The criticism and anger focused on the barbed wire fence that surrounded the camp, which is what you're seeing here in this image. People criticizing the fence were upset at the imagery of such a structure. They argued that Shaar Ha'aliya was supposed to be a space of welcoming and homecoming, and that the fence made it look like European DP camps or even worse, concentration camps. And these are the terms that come up repeatedly in the archival documents. People defending the fence repeatedly emphasized that it was a structure that was necessary to maintain a quarantine. And quarantine, they argued, was itself a necessary and normative public health measure to protect the larger society from diseases the immigrants were carrying. Here, I've brought you a couple examples of the criticism of the barbed wire fence. This is from the famous photojournalist Robert Capa, who, in addition to taking photographs of Shaar Ha'aliya, also wrote an article about his time there. And he described it this way. He said, "So the people of the barbed wire, who have passed through scores of concentration and refugee camps in the last decade, reach the land of their dreams, only to be back once more behind barbed wire." This is from a long article that was published in March 1951 that highlights the difficult experience for immigrants at Shaar Ha'aliya. The title of the article is Shaar Ha'aliya o Machaneh Hezger, which translates into a gate of immigration or a quarantine camp. This is a play on the name of the camp, which was Shaar Ha'aliya, a gate of immigration. The image of the barbed wire, which you see here, features prominently throughout the article. And throughout the article, it's clear that the author is very critical of the presence of the barbed wire. And here's just one example of the defense of the barbed wire enclosure with the explanation that it was a medical necessity. This is from a report, an internal report on Shaar Ha'aliya from 1952. And where I'm pretty sure that this is the Yehuda Weisberger, who you had seen earlier. He's writing, "One of the aims of the camp is the isolation of the new immigrant from the moment he arrives until after the medical examination. The isolation is the only guarantee to protect the Israeli yeshuv, or the community outside, from epidemics and disease that could have flooded the country as a result of the mass immigration." In my book, I explore the problems with the public health defense of Shaar Ha'aliya's enclosure. I focus on the contradiction evident in the fact that the barbed wire fence and the police guard didn't prevent people from coming in and out. And that's what we're seeing in this picture. I love this photograph, and in some ways I sort of built my book around it. This picture was taken by the famous photojournalist Robert Capa when he was visiting Shaar Ha'aliya in 1949. What Capa captured here was widely known and discussed. Officially, immigrants were forbidden to leave the camp until they had completed their medical exam, and so the main entrance was off limits to them for the duration of their stay. Crawling under the barbed wire to get in and out of the camp allowed the immigrants the freedom to largely go on with their lives. They visited family in the rest of the country. They went up to the city of Haifa for entertainment. They went to look for jobs, and they bought products on the black market. In many cases, they returned to the camp later in the day and they just crawled under the barbed wire to get back in. This situation prompted one official to say, quote, "In theory, the camp is closed, but in reality, it's open to all." Moreover, the main ailments that were found and tracked in Shaar Ha'aliya were trachoma, tuberculosis, syphilis, head lice, and scabies. None of these were deemed quarantinable in Israel at the time. The Shaar Ha'aliya administration knew that the breaches were a regular occurrence, but they didn't see them as an indication that the quarantine was failing and that the barbed wire fence and police could be removed. Instead, they continued paradoxically to insist that the quarantine was necessary to protect the rest of the country from diseases borne by the immigrants. And so I raised the question, how could the same people who knew that the fence was ineffectual still insist that it was medically necessary? Quarantine, understood broadly, is a cross-cultural act of separation that's been used as a means of survival for thousands of years. The biblical discussion of isolation for lepers or Mitzora'im in Leviticus 13 is largely understood as the starting point for the European concept of quarantine. Although the term itself was first coined in 14th century plague-ridden Italy. A 40-day period of isolation was enforced on both people and objects entering a port so that any symptoms of poor health could be observed, and in that way, the plague could be prevented from entering the city. The English word quarantine is derived from the Italian word for 40. Today, in public health policy, there's an important distinction between quarantine and isolation. Isolation is the separation of someone who's known to have a communicable disease and who's then kept isolated to prevent the spread of infection. Quarantine is the time in which someone who has potentially been exposed to a communicable disease is left isolated for a period of observation to see whether the symptoms of the disease do indeed develop. In some cases, quarantine is imposed to protect a person who's already sick, and this is to protect a weak immune system from the hazards of other infection. There's no one physical form of a quarantine. It could be an island, a building, a room, a village, or it could be a camp enclosed by a fence. Shaar Ha'aliya's story is best understood within critical studies that take a broad approach to quarantine history, situating it within discussions of modern isolating practices. As the case of Shaar Ha'aliya illustrates, quarantine is not always as straightforward as a particular public health policy. It's an act of exclusion, a barrier put in place to isolate the threats of contagion, and it's a complex disciplinary mechanism that can be at once protective and punitive. The contradictions in the defense of the Shaar Ha'aliya fence developed out of a combination of fear, fences as a powerful response to fear, and medicine as a powerful conceptual frame. The people making the health disease argument for Shaar Ha'aliya were part of the environment that was feeling threatened by the arriving immigrants and the uncertain times and conditions of the newly established country. Quarantine and the medical reasoning behind it gave them authoritative and reassuring ideas to turn to. In the words of anthropologist Mary Douglas, they offered, quote, hard lines and clear concepts. They offered a sense of control in response to the vulnerability many Israelis felt during the period of the mass immigration. Excuse me, sorry. Shaar Ha'aliya is at the heart of the history of Israel's establishment. It teaches us about Israel's relationship with its immigrants, the experiences of arrival for hundreds of thousands of new Israelis, and the crucial role that medicine, health, and disease played in Israeli nation building. Through Shaar Ha'aliya's erasure from Israel's national space, it teaches us about the parts of the Israeli past that the state endorses through official remembrances, and the parts of the Israeli past that the state excludes. And finally, Shaar Ha'aliya teaches us about the history of quarantine practices, which is a lesson that takes on a new urgency as we find ourselves in the midst of the devastating COVID-19 pandemic and this historic moment of quarantine. So my book was published on December 13th, 2019. On January 23rd, 2020, the city of Wuhan was shut down. On February 23rd, 10 Italian cities were shut down. From there, the rest of the world soon followed. And so this book on quarantine had little over 1 month to exist in a world where quarantine was an anomaly. And clearly that is no longer the case. As I wrote my book, and for that brief pre-COVID-19 moment that it appeared, I saw the subject of quarantine first and foremost as a window into Israeli history. I asked, if we look at the way people dealt with the quarantine at Shaar Ha'aliya, what can we learn about Israel, its establishment, its society? A second question was what this story can tell us about the history of immigration in the 20th century. And lastly, I wanted to understand what Shaar Ha'aliya can tell us about the history of and ethics of and concept of quarantine. Yet, right now, not only has the last question become the more pressing one, but it's also led into a larger existential problem for the field and for my own scholarship. In this most critical moment of quarantine history, what does the history of quarantine actually offer? And what does Shaar Ha'aliya's quarantine history offer? Researching quarantine can give us a captivating window into a specific society while helping us consider some of the most fundamental facets of human emotion and behavior: fear, exclusion, welcoming, and care. These days, it's possible to appreciate that what's been happening to all of us is as fascinating as anything ever researched. What we're all experiencing behind our masks, our computer screens, our sealed border crossings, this all fits predictably within quarantine history. At its core, quarantine is about boundaries. It's about establishing physical barriers for survival against contagion. We, as individuals, families, communities, countries, we make decisions about who will be on the outside and who will be on the inside of our boundaries. Quarantine affirms priorities. It defines relationships. Quarantine history teaches us that this seemingly primitive, simple measure of separation is critical for saving lives. However, quarantine history also teaches us that this act of distancing can bring out dark and primal sides of human behavior. This part of the history can be deeply unsettling, perhaps now more than ever, as we see its themes reverberate all at once in all corners of the globe. It's terrifying to know the history of draconian exclusions, where people are brutally cast out by others who are panicked by the fear of contagion. It's distressing to know that historically, quarantine measures have often been abused to target and further discriminate against marginalized, vulnerable communities. As we all try to cope with the many impossible layers of this experience, does knowing this history actually help us? Admittedly, in the midst of our current global unraveling, I've had moments where I felt that the pursuit of this history, and perhaps even the study of history more broadly, is futile if our governments and our policymakers are not studying this history and using it to protect those under their care. Of what use is it? There's a depressing historical predictability to the social outcomes of this pandemic. Vulnerable minorities being put at risk by people ignorantly scapegoating them for the virus. And we don't have to look far for an example of this with the American president's egregious anti-Asian statements. We see a public health crisis being used to further nativist and xenophobic closures. And we see legitimate public fears of contagion being manipulated to further authoritarian agendas. What I return to is this: not only is this history not futile, it is more important than ever. It's crucial to keep this past in the forefront of our minds so that we may consider critically and reflectively the various ways quarantine is being used in our world. This history reminds us of the important life-saving value of quarantine measures, while at the same time it reminds us to stay on guard, to gauge and to fight the ways discrimination is shape-shifting to fit this current age of quarantine. Shaar Ha'aliya's specific history reminds us of quarantine's long and important role, both as a public health measure against dangerous disease and as a fundamental human act of self-preservation. The context for the quarantine at Shaar Ha'aliya was Israel's vulnerable community, panicked by the real possibility that the large wave of new immigrants would overwhelm the country with dangerous epidemics. The setting apart through quarantine was a natural, clear, and authoritative recourse. At the same time, this history is an inauspicious warning about the way that quarantine can be misused by people in power and the lasting harm that such misuse can leave. We have the persuasive archival evidence to suggest that the barbed wire fence at Shaar Ha'aliya was not necessary from a health standpoint. And for many of the Israelis who went through Shaar Ha'aliya, the experience of being held behind barbed wire remains a bitter scar on their experience of immigrating to Israel. However, accounts of Shaar Ha'aliya are also filled with countless stories of immigrants staging strikes, writing critical letters, and staging protests. This history serves as a reminder of the different shapes that protest can take on and the power that protest gives to individuals who might otherwise seem powerless. Beyond specific historical case studies and themes, and perhaps less obviously, the study of history itself is also important right now as a source of encouragement to push us through the prolonged emotional difficulty of the pandemic. The imaginative thinking that is vital to the historical discipline encourages us to think beyond our immediate situation, to envision the day that this is all behind us, when our own existential challenges become the intellectual challenges of future historians. It will be many years before we can look at our current plague with the privilege of hindsight. Until then, we have the privilege and the responsibility to study other histories from a dispassionate distance. We can find in the history of the Shaar Ha'aliya quarantine timely warnings and timely encouragement. Both warrant our attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Rhona. That was really fascinating.
Thank you.
I wanted to start off by asking you, how did you find this topic? And also, what got you interested in the history of medicine in the first place?
Yeah, great. I'm happy to answer that question. The history of medicine more broadly, my father is a physician who does research on the history of medicine. And so I was always exposed to this from the perspective, he was always very clear about the fact that he was a physician approaching this as opposed to an historian. And I now that I'm an historian, I really appreciate the fact that he makes this distinction sort of modestly. But I was able to see that this is a really fascinating field and that it really gets to some sort of fundamental issues about society that are so interesting and also so important. Some of the things that I mentioned just in, the idea of like care, how society cares for people, issues of power are also there in the history of medicine. So that was the history of medicine more globally. And then when I realized that I wanted to do Israeli history, I looked into what was being done with the history of medicine in Israel. And there were some really exciting things with Shifra Schwartz, who became my PhD advisor. Her work on the history of Kupat Cholim, and then Nadav Davidovich and Sandy Safian, who's at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She's done amazing work on the history of malaria. And so there were some really exciting things happening. So I could see that this was going to be a field that I could be excited about and that I continue to be excited about. Shaar Ha'aliya specifically, just very early on in my PhD, sort of fortunately, I was reading an article that Shifra Schwartz and Nadav Davidovich wrote, and they mentioned Shaar Ha'aliya. And I had a bunch of questions, so I went to find out more about it, and I realized that really almost nothing had been written about it. So, and at the time it was this moment where I was like, okay, well, my contribution to the history of Shaar Ha'aliya is going to be by focusing on the medical aspects of Shaar Ha'aliya. And then I remember going to the library very early on in my PhD, expecting all of these books to have been written about Shaar Ha'aliya, and there was nothing. There's one, my book is the first scholarly book on the history of Shaar Ha'aliya, and besides that, there's a really important journal that Yuda Weisberger wrote. So that was how I got into the topic. I could also just add to that one of the things that I sort of going along with this, that there really hasn't been that much written about Shaar Ha'aliya. In my mind, there should be, right? There should be just shelves filled with books on the history of Shaar Ha'aliya, the same way that you would think about how many books have been written about Ellis Island, or how much research has been done on Ellis Island. And so if there are some, grad students out there or scholars who are looking for great topics, right? There's so much more to be done on the history of Shaar Ha'aliya.
Well, and actually, like, to that point, so why do you think that is? Like, do people just remember Shaar Ha'aliya? Like, is there some way, sort of, is it just people talk about it? Is there some official commemoration? Who remembers it or talks about it today?
Yeah, so that's a really great, that's a really, really great subject. And so the last chapter of my book is focused on the issue of memory of Shaar Ha'aliya and the remembrances of Shaar Ha'aliya in Israel today. And the one of the things I just find so interesting is that really on a national sort of public level, there's been this erasure. That on a personal level, there are many artistic remembrances. One of the most famous is a song by the singer Chava Alberstein. She wrote a song about Shaar Ha'aliya that's quite famous. I mean, maybe younger people today don't know it, but and it also appears in novels. Eli Amir, in his novels, it has references to Shaar Ha'aliya. And then in memoirs and in people who went through Shaar Ha'aliya in oral history, you have that presence of the history. But the place itself, right? So this, as I say in my talk, right? There's no parallel to Shaar Ha'aliya, and the space of Shaar Ha'aliya up until a year and a half ago, which is the last time I went to check, right? There's nothing there marking what it was. There is the name, but there's not even a plaque sort of describing anything. And every couple of years while I was writing my book, I would go just to make sure that chapter was up to date, right? And that they hadn't built this incredible museum, which is what, is some sort of commemoration that deserves to be there. And I just saw sort of over the years that there's nothing. And this then is what I contrast that with the athlete camp, which is around 15 minutes away for those of you, right? You know Haifa well, right? It's 15 minutes away or so, right? A 15-minute drive from the historic spot of Shaar Ha'aliya. And there you have a huge museum, a really important museum that pretty much everyone, I feel like everyone in Israel knows it, right? When I was writing my dissertation and over the years, whenever I said I was writing about Shaar Ha'aliya, just sort of to random people, they would say, oh, you mean athlete? They'd heard of athlete, but they hadn't heard of Shaar Ha'aliya. And that sort of contrast between what is being commemorated so significantly at athlete and what's being ignored at Shaar Ha'aliya is very fascinating and important in my mind.
You actually say a little more, like, why remember athlete but not Shaar Ha'aliya?
Well, because athlete's easy to remember, and Shaar Ha'aliya is harder to remember. I mean, that's sort of the easy answer. And the athlete, right? One of the things that I discuss in this chapter on memory is how if you were to build an honest sort of replica of Shaar Ha'aliya, the way that they've built sort of this reconstruction in athlete if it was going to be historically honest, it would actually look something like what they've built at Atlit. Atlit was a detention camp in the British Mandate period. So Jews who were immigrating to Palestine illegally were put in Atlit, right? And so today that's commemorated as this place where Jews suffered under other people. And a big part of that is the use of barbed wire, right? And the presence of barbed wire in the camp, the way that they've remade this space with this barbed wire. And throughout the camp, there are these remembrances of how we finally reached the promised land. Finally, we reached the land of Israel, and here of all places, we were put behind barbed wire. And that's the way that it's very publicly presented in Atlit. And Shaar Ha'aliya would look similar, except there it's Israelis, right? And the barbed wire. I think it's a much more complicated history, and obviously one that I think that needs to be told. But that's the simple answer.
No, again, that makes a lot of sense, right? This sort of needing to have a story of arrival that's a more positive one.
Right. And that's easier, right? It's just so easier to deal with. I mean, this obviously, and this is something that I discuss sort of in greater detail, obviously, in the chapter. But it's this is something that's sort of common throughout, in national projects or memorial projects. And it's really interesting to always think about what is being, getting the attention of memory and history, and what isn't. But that in that particular case, I think it's really interesting, especially how close they are physically is really so interesting to me.
Well, and again, the part I kept thinking of was also that because in Shaar Ha'aliya you have immigrants, not just like from all of these different places, right? So you've had like new museums for sort of more Mizrahi history and like this experience of discrimination, but at Shaar Ha'aliya, it's Holocaust survivors and Mizrahim together. Right. So I wondered if you could talk a little more about this sort of experience of immigration that happens at Shaar Ha'aliya. And also, do you see any kind of parallels today with the global refugee crisis?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, the experience of immigration, I think, is one of the most important things in Shaar Ha'aliya, and especially now, I think, because quarantine is such a critical issue with what we're going through, right? Shaar Ha'aliya isn't just about quarantine, and it's first and foremost about the experiences of these 400,000, right? Over 400,000 or so immigrants who went through and had these extraordinary experiences. And I really try to sort of emphasize that in my book and really celebrate that. Right? There are these extraordinary stories of arrival and just sort of the way that people dealt with their situations, and a situation that was really not easy was really amazing and so exciting to read about. With the current global refugee crisis, it's something that I think about a lot, obviously, and especially somebody whose research focuses on immigration history. Obviously, the situation is sort of every historical event is unique in and of itself, right? But the themes that we can learn from the past to help us better navigate and better understand our current situation is always so important. And I think any situation that can also, any story that can increase compassion towards refugees and towards immigrants is something that's critical, right? And you think about something that I was reading recently, I don't remember the source off the top of my head, but I could get it for somebody who's interested, was about that the Mediterranean is currently the most deadly border in the world, right? And I can't help but think about the fact that Shaar Ha'aliya was also, right, this is the border, this is where Shaar Ha'aliya was. And then obviously the crisis at the border in America and sort of this sort of harsh xenophobia that's so prevalent in the world, and this lack of compassion towards people who are uprooting themselves and how are being forced to be uprooted in this way, I think is something that I definitely see the ties with.
Well, actually, on that note, I wanted to start talking about some of the audience questions. And so one of them was saying how, like today in the US, you have this binary between quarantine and herd immunity. And some people reject this binary choice. Were there similar arguments about the quarantine at Shaar Ha'aliya? Did people propose alternatives to having so many people in the camp for so long?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, first of all, there's the fact that, right, that they didn't intend for people to be in the camp for so long, right? That was something that it really deteriorated into pretty quickly. But you see in the archival documents also the workers there and the director and people desperately sort of trying to, with whatever they could, to fix the situation, but they were just quite powerless. I think one of the questions that I've sort of come up with, and I don't think I actually write this in the book but I don't know if it's come up just recently in the past few months where I've started to think about my book very differently, right? But is that I wonder why they didn't take down the barbed wire, right? How this could have been so different and whether it would have been different. And I think that it probably would have if it hadn't been a barbed wire fence. Um, and and that one of the things that I found in the documents is also that when they Shaar Ha'aliya was originally a British army camp. That was the structure that it was built on, and then they renovated the camp to turn it into make it sort of more suitable. And they spent several weeks renovating it to make it accessible and to make it sort of what they would need it to be. And there were barbed wire fences within the camp, and they removed those, right? We have documents saying that that was part of the renovations, that they removed those barbed wire fences, but they retained the barbed wire fence. And I wondered, like, maybe if I had even seen a document saying, like, we kept this barbed wire fence just because we didn't have money and it would have been really expensive to change it. But I don't see that, right? I have the people saying, like, we need this, we need this, we need this.
Well, and also did the doctors, the people in charge of the camp, talk about how its conditions might actually promote the spread of disease? If you have so many people and you said it was becoming filthy, was that a concern?
Well, that's definitely something that that historians, people are talking about the period at the time. They were concerned, right, about the health conditions, sort of generally, and then also with all of the immigrants coming in, and then of course, like with the Ma'abarot, the transit camps, or these that are built as of the 1950s, right? Health and the health conditions there were a serious concern for physicians and doctors. And then and that was sort of, these are some of the major issues that, and also with just generally sort of with the people there. But it was also just sort of the conditions also of the time of having so many people coming in at the time and so quickly, that this feeling of things sort of just kind of spiraling out of control to some extent.
Well, actually, so going off that, can you talk a bit more about the protests and petitions at the camp, and how did like the Israeli government and the press respond to the fact that, you have Kappa saying, like, look at this wire, look at this concentration camp?
Right. Well, what Kappa saying it, I mean, he was one of many people, and many Israelis were saying it too, right? And the immigrants were saying it. It was people in the Israeli press were saying it. So that was something that was kind of prevalent. The sort of the main response that sort of that kept coming up was, right, that this is medically necessary, and sort of saying, like, this is unfortunate and we see what this looks like. This is unfortunate, but it's necessary. And then just reverting back to the medical aspect of it, which makes sense, right? The public health aspect of it, which is definitely a concern. But then this issue that people knew that it was widely known. I don't remember at what point in my research I found that, this wasn't just Kappa capturing this one moment. There are other images of it. This is something that was widely discussed, that people were coming in and out of the fence and crawling under the barbed wire. And that's something that's really, really interesting. The protests are these amazing stories of people just not accepting the conditions that they had. There are tons and tons of letters that people wrote, immigrants, people outside of, non-immigrants who were upset with what they saw, and they were writing letters to the camp administration. They were writing letters to newspapers, having them published. So that was one thing that you see going on. Also with the protest, there was there was one thing that I'm working on with my tuberculosis project, and that I discussed sort of briefly in the book. There was a hunger strike that a group of Olim, or new immigrants, who were sick with tuberculosis, and they were at Shaar Ha'aliya, and they were not happy with the conditions they had there. And so they staged a hunger strike to change their conditions there. And then you have just these daily occurrences with people. One amazing encounter of a mother whose child was in the sort of hospital in Shaar Ha'aliya, and they weren't allowing parents in. And so she and her husband put a ladder to the window of the hospital and climbed in and took their son. And then I found other documents from the administration's end saying that this is something that this happened quite often, right? This wasn't just the one occurrence of the woman that I interviewed. So the presence sort of a protest is really prevalent. I do one thing to sort of highlight there is also the fact that I see this as also being a situation of tremendous privilege as well, because the people they knew that people were not deported from Shaar Ha'aliya, right? So this isn't the situation that you have, like, for example, in Ellis Island, where you have this kind of fear of one wrong move and you'll be deported, right? This isn't something that was happening at Shaar Ha'aliya. So this is also this issue of kind of sense of kind of belonging and empowerment and feeling of entitlement to, like, this is to sort of the goings on of the state that are being expressed right there.
Well, and also, I mean, I'm so glad you told the story of the mother taking her son, because it was also because, right, the son was sick.
Yeah,
and it was right. And she's saying, like, he's not getting good care in the hospital, so I need to take him home.
Right. I mean, that's also one of the issues that I think is so critical, and that when I think, going back to your question about the refugee crisis, is always sort of thinking about how different a refugee or an immigrant experience is when the person has a language that they feel comfortable, that they can communicate with the people, with officials, and how different it is for a person who is not in that situation, where the person who has this power or you're engaging with doesn't speak a language that you guys can communicate in. And so the mother, I mean, you have situations where stories and oral history, also, and testimonies of the healthcare workers who were, this sense of frustration or like desperation of dealing with health in these conditions, and wanting sort of to give this care, and not being able to communicate with the parents with what they felt needed to be done. But you do definitely have this also gap a lot of the time with parents and mothers, between this feeling of, like, I know how to take care of my child and I need my child close, which is just, heartbreaking and very moving. And in that story, I see it as being very fortunate, because the mother was able to communicate with the physician in Yiddish. Right, they were managed to, but if somebody wasn't able to, how different that experience is.
I also wanted to ask, were the residents in Haifa concerned about all of these immigrants fleeing the camp and fleeing the quarantine? Did they sort of talk about it? Did they use language of public health?
That's a great question. I don't know if it's sort of more specifically sort of with the residents of Haifa, but I know that that was definitely something that was part of the larger discourse, right? With articles that are being published in support of the quarantine or in support of the fence, and saying like this again, this is unfortunate, but this is necessary, right? And a lot of the time, the imagery is very, very visceral. Of like, imagine a new immigrant coming up into Haifa and sitting on the bus, and somebody with tuberculosis sitting on the bus and then infecting us, right? And that's why we need this, right? Not taking into account that, first of all, the workers who worked at Shaar Ha'aliya, they didn't live on the premises. They came and went every day, right? And so it's also the issue of sort of that they could be carrying any contagious diseases, and also that that people who were settled and not immigrants could be carrying diseases to the immigrants as well, right? So that's something that I think very much in terms of the privilege of hindsight and being able to kind of again dispassionately reflect on it, you're able to sort of raise these questions.
Also, do you think there was like, did Shaar Ha'aliya like actually, sort of end up creating a community between the disparate immigrants who were coming in? Because I know, because again, right, there's a sort of question of like, if most of the immigrants are coming from the Middle East and you have like an Ashkenazi government that sees them,
Right.
in sort of a different light, then would that be part of the barbed wire story? But as you talk about in the book, it's Holocaust survivors and Mizrahim together. Did this help? Did this create some sort of unity among the different groups, or did they kind of keep separate, especially with the language barriers?
Yeah, it's also a great question. I think I guess that's something that somebody else could also, that would be a great topic to research even more. I know that in there are a lot of sort of individual encounters, right there. And one of the things I write in my book is that like stories from the 1950s in Israel, in addition to these many difficult stories, and there were many difficult stories, they're also filled with many wonderful stories of, sort of the kindness of strangers, of people sort of building communities surrounding, based on the fact that they're immigrants. A lot of these stories are things that I know, like from Beersheba and sort of in the 1950s. And so I would be surprised if we didn't have those. I mean, we have those also in Shaar Ha'aliya, even more than I know of at this point. In terms of sort of leaving it today, I don't know if there's enough of a kind of broader community of like we went through Shaar Ha'aliya and sort of experienced this. The ways that I've seen it remembered sort of within groups is still within that polarizing sort of Ashkenazi Mizrahi kind of way. But maybe if there were to be some sort of a better or any kind of national space for remembrance that could be highlighted, ideally. But yeah, I think also on an individual level, there are those stories, but I don't know about it happening on a larger level. Now that I'll just add to that though, that I know that, for example, the hunger strike with the tuberculosis patients, there were Mizrahim or Sfaradim and Ashkenazim in that group. So that's at least one case where we see it happening.
Great. No, again, this is a really fascinating topic. I want to ask one more specific audience question,
Yeah.
Which is, can you talk a little more about Yehuda Weisberger and sort of why did he come from Poland at age 19, and where in Poland did he come from?
Yeah, I don't remember where exactly in Poland he came from. I may have written it in my book. I don't think so, but there's information available on him if for anyone who reads Hebrew. He wrote that he sort of wrote it, but his this memoir, this book on Shaar Ha'aliya that exists as a sort of memoir of his time in Shaar Ha'aliya. So it probably has more detailed information on him. So I don't know where exactly in Poland he came from, but he left, and because of the rise of anti-Semitism and that throughout Europe and in Poland that he was experiencing. His brother survived, And there's this really, I found both moving and fascinating moment that he recounts of when he first saw his brother, after sort of he had come through, and his sort of struggle with him being sort of that Yuda was struggling with as being the director of the camp and being responsible for so many things, and then just feeling like he desperately wanted to go over to his brother. So he was fascinating. He's very much to sort of, thanks to him, also so much of the documents about Shaar Ha'aliya have been preserved. And he sort of saw, one of the requests that he made over the years was to have, he wanted there to be an official, I think, author who was to come and just document all of the extraordinary stories about Shaar Ha'aliya when it was happening. And that was never recognized. But his documents that exist in the Central Zionist Archives are phenomenal.
Great. So again, I wanted to thank you for this really wonderful and fascinating presentation.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so I wanted to say thank you to everyone who also made this event possible, who made it possible for us to invite Professor Seidelman to speak. So I'd like to thank the funding for the CU Boulder Endowed Chair of Israel-Palestine Studies, also the CU Department of History, Sean Wall, who's been running the AV, the tech support behind us, Linda Park, who is, sort of like she's the program manager for the program in Jewish Studies. And she's been doing so much with this, with organization and publicity. And I'd also like to thank Danya and Eyal Rivlin, who wrote and performed the song Shalom at the beginning of the talk. So as we mentioned at the beginning, this talk is part of a series. So this is Plague and Quarantine, Past and Present in Israel-Palestine. So the next talk is The End of the Tunnel is Dark, Reflections on the COVID-19 Pandemic Under Occupation. And so Professor William Hamoudeh from the Institute of Community and Public Health at Birzeit University is going to talk about sort of the structural factors affecting COVID in the occupied territories, but also looking at the experience of it for people living there. And so that's coming up Tuesday, October 27th from noon to 1 p.m. Mountain Time. I really hope you guys can come.
Thank you so much, Professor Talisman. And again, just thank you so much to Professor Seidelman for this conversation. Really sort of just a fascinating chapter in history that I think we've unfortunately forgotten, and I think we are all the better for having recovered. Two quick final words before we take our leave of one another tonight. The first is that in addition to this Israel-Palestine series, we have a number of other series that we offer here in the program in Jewish Studies. You'll hear more soon about programs we'll be running in the spring relating to Jewish studies and race in the United States. But before that, we have the next installment of our Peak to Peak series. Some of you may know this program. This is a partnership we have with the Office of Outreach and Engagement and a number of civic organizations across Colorado. So we'll have two webinars coming up this fall. Professor Talisman will be presenting some of her own research and a conversation on the topic Exams and Extremists, Standardized Testing, Politics and Crisis in the Middle East. That will be on Thursday, November 19th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. And then in December, Professor Yonatan Malin in the College of Music will be giving a presentation on the topic Klezmer Music as Jewish Dialogue and Jewish Discourse. We hope that you'll join us for those conversations and for a number of other programs in the spring. And then finally, I just want to offer a word of thanks. We throw around the word community a lot in academic settings, but that's really what we strive to be here. A community of diverse individuals who are coming together to think with one another, learn with one another, and really to grow with one another. I know that you have many Zoom options out there. You also tonight have a presidential debate. And we're really honored that you took the time to create our community. With that, I want to open up the chat again so that everyone who so chooses can feel free to say farewell and again to say goodbye and to thank you all for joining us and learning with us this evening.